Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody's having a nice evening. Just so you all know, you're in the right place. This is the book launch for On the Road Less Traveled, An Unlikely Journey from the Orphanage to the Boardroom by Ed Hajim. My name's Judy, and I will be your host for tonight. You know, when you start life on your own, it's hard to imagine your future self as a community leader, a businessman, family man, role model, or even an author. Time is spent trying to survive, to prove to yourself and others that you are not damaged goods. You have value. It's particularly impossible to see any benefit from the seemingly insurmountable hurdles you face each day. Well, tonight you will all get to meet a man who has done just that, Ed Hajim. But before we get to Ed, I'd like to focus on some members of the audience. Over the last 6 years, I have come to see many examples of young people who have succeeded in a way they likely couldn't have imagined as a young child. I met these spectacular people through my work at the Wiley Network. And I think there are about 16 Wiley scholars in here in this group tonight. Love it if you gave a shout out to Ed, congratulating him on his book. It's our great privilege at Wiley to walk side by side with college students who are navigating college on their own. We're the holders of the mirror that allow them to see their strengths as they learn to manage the obstacles of their childhood and thrive as young adults. Ed would have been a Wiley scholar had Wiley existed when he arrived by himself at the University of Rochester back in 1954. He had a suitcase full of clothes that did not fit, that infamous black leather jacket, and he was surrounded by proud families dropping their children off at school as he walked alone into his dorm. As the founder of Wiley, I was introduced to Ed just this summer. And from my first visit with Ed, I marveled at his ability to see the benefit of a program like Wiley, when he could have just taken the stance, I made it without help, so can they. But no, that's not Ed. When you meet Ed tonight, listen carefully to his clear reflections of both the consequences and the benefits of his adverse childhood experiences. As he tells his story in a way that you can see the strength this brings to him, not the liabilities. Are there lingering challenges in his life? Yes, but he took advantage of the opportunity to address them, and they did not derail them. Ed could have spoken on his own tonight, but we thought a conversation might be helpful. There are other programs like Wiley around the country, and one of the very early influencers on this work was Maddy Day. Now, the first thing you need to know about Maddy is that she is open to new ideas. At least that's my experience. As a stranger, when I approached her about the concept of Wiley, she welcomed me with open arms and has been a mentor and colleague since. Now she supports Wiley as a speaker, consultant, and today she's our moderator. Tonight, her job is to help you get to know Ed and why you must read the book and share it with your friends. She is an expert in the area of foster care and college, among many other things. Before I turn the evening over to my friends, I want to give you a glimpse of Ed's book, because tonight is the book launch. Tonight, Ed's book is truly born and can be purchased at your local booksellers and of course online. If you have any questions along the way tonight, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to answer them at the end of the conversation. Maddy, Ed, I'm so lucky to call you colleagues and friends. And after tonight, I'm sure the audience will feel the same way. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was a very generous introduction. And I just want to say good evening to everybody. As Judy said, my name is Maddy Day. I'm the owner and a senior consultant with Maddy Day LLC and Associates, where we are working to create a culture of accountability in child welfare, education, and systems reform. We're going to talk about Ed's journey, and in many ways, Ed's journey is something that I think has perfectly intersected with my life at this point in time. And as I read his book, I reflected on my own journey to be at this point. 15 years ago, I began my work, or I should say, I began my journey toward working in the field of foster care and higher education while sitting in a cafe in Seattle. I was a, little social worker, case manager, doing case management and foster home licensing, and on the cusp of social worker burnout, after seeing too many failed stories, too many young people who I wasn't able to support and make a difference. And I told my friend, I said, if I could make sure that every young person out there who was in foster care that wanted to get a college degree could get a college degree, then I would feel like I actually helped someone. Because just 5 years into my professional career, I already knew the truth that when a young person comes into foster care, we, the social workers, the supporters, the professional people who are supposed to be here to support them, can take just about everything that they have away. And one of those few exceptions is their education. And that was the day that I committed to this work. And little did I know that I was about to become a pioneer, joining with other visionary souls who shared this belief, folks like Judy, and folks who had a vision for what could be, even before policies recognized that education is a fundamental part of well-being for our young people. And little did I know that there were others like Ed, who were the living proof that when a person has support to overcome those barriers to education and career success, they can do just about anything that they want to do. And so with that, I want to dive into my conversation with Ed, and I will let folks know that we will have about, a half an hour of questions. Conversation between Ed and myself, but the richness of this will also come from you all asking questions. And so as you are hearing things, and have questions, if you've already, as I know some of you have, dove into the book, and we did hear that there are some fact checkers out there, Ed, so no getting away with half truths this time. But if any of those fact checkers out there also want to ask questions, we would love to hear from you. So please be sure, as Judy said, to put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll have some time at the end to respond to them. So, Ed, are you ready to dive in?
I'm ready.
All right, always ready. I love it. So, as I was reading your book, I was really struck.
Maddy, if I could just take 1 minute to just thank
Absolutely.
Judy. I want to thank Judy. And, it was this summer when she captured me. And immediately I felt myself, I would have been much better off if I was a Wiley Scholar. So tonight I also, when we're talking and thinking about this, thinking about the concept of what Maddy's doing and what Judy's doing, I want to highlight Wiley as well. Thank you, Maddy, for taking time, and let's dive in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I do hope all of our scholars out there, Wiley or other scholars from campus support programs, we want you to ask questions too. This is an opportunity to speak to another alumni of foster care and really, talk about your journeys together. So thank you for that, Ed. So as I was reading the book, I was struck by the similarities and differences of the foster care and orphanage system that you experienced and then the one that we have today. And in many ways, your experience is moving place to place and having a range of quality of care from those who are charged to be your caregivers, and the feeling of stigma and otherness still resonate when I speak to young people today about their experience in the foster care system. And then there was this bright spot that just warmed my heart early on. And that was Mrs. Robb, a foster mother whom you mentioned very fondly, with a note saying, and I thought this was just funny, but also telling about your experience, but a note where she was very concerned about how skinny you were, right? And she really wanted to fatten you up. And I just, I thought about this variance of experience and was wondering, how was your experience with the Robbs different from other foster care experiences that you had?
One of the things one has to recognize whenever you're writing a book, and what's helped me in writing this book, you have to basically focus on context. And don't forget, this was the 1940s. Mm-hmm. The foster care system then, people were poorer. And the people that took on foster children normally took them on, maybe not out of the goodness of their heart, but was a business almost. They brought somebody into their home where they could earn a little money, Some actually were good and some were not so good. The Robs were very different from most of the foster parents because they really wanted a companion for their son. So they took me on as a child in their family. And also they were better off than most of the prior foster parents. So they have a very different attitude toward me. And right away, right off the bat, they treated me very equal with basically their son. The other foster homes were not the same. The first one was basically they were just in it for the money, and the money wasn't that good. My father didn't pay as regularly as he should, and so it was a very difficult circumstance. That only lasted a year. So the foster home, the Robs were very special. I think what's happened over the years, you have more and more Robs, and fewer of those people will take on the job just for the compensation. But you had to check the context. I mean, even the people that took us on just for, let's say, just as a business, were still very good people because they were taking on a very definite responsibility. And there was a foster care system. There was a woman who came around once a month and checked in. So they had to be, reasonable. And by the way, I'm very worried about the fact checkers. Both my roommate at Harvard is a fact checker and my daughter's a fact checker. So I've got to be very careful. It made me more nervous. And all the people have checked in. We've got quite an audience tonight. So, but the foster care system is basically, it's contextual. And I think it's changed quite a bit. When I listen to what you've done and what Wiley has done, it's a very different experience completely. Mm-hmm. But I did pick up over time Wiley kind of people throughout my life. But the Robs were very special. And to this day, going back and rereading those letters made actually, gave me a little touch to my heart. She was a very special woman, Mrs. Rob.
Yeah. Well, the piece that I really picked up on was that you started to thrive under their care. You developed interests in music and different things. And I think that speaks to your sense of belonging, which is really, what you're talking about. And, unfortunately, and as folks will understand, there's a lot that, transpires over your life, but, you weren't able to stay with them. And when we get to you in high school, you spoke about your experience of feeling like you didn't belong. And you said, I came to be like an outsider looking in. I thought that made me strong and independent. And in retrospect, I was wrong. And, what's clear is that you were, looking for this looking for a sense of belonging, but that was taken from you in so many different ways and in so many different layers. And then you developed this survival mechanism out of being independent, but it didn't always serve you. And I would love to hear your perspective on kind of the two sides of the coin of this independence that both helped you to survive, pushed you forward, but also kind of held you back in some ways.
Well, you're absolutely right. Being independent or making yourself independent allowed you not to depend on anyone else. And having been disappointed so many times in my life, father, mother, foster parents, even your friends. In other words, given the fact, if you look back at my life, I had 5 foster homes, you really didn't have a chance to develop friends, people you could depend on. So the really survival was independence, depending only on yourself. And that's what, and it's very important to recognize that this builds a certain self-confidence, but also builds a certain sort of shield. You don't ever take people in. And it turned out to be very, very necessary during parts of my life. But later on, I lost out because I didn't really take people's advice. The headmaster or the senior person at the orphanage was a very, very wonderful person. And he wanted to give me advice. He wanted to help me. And I wouldn't let him because I didn't want to depend on him. So it really turned out to be a negative. Over time, especially in college, I started to pick up people who were really interested in me. And that really helped me quite a bit. And that's where Wiley comes in. Wiley starts out when you're a freshman in college, you've got somebody to talk to. And so you don't have to be completely independent. Being completely independent gives you a very narrow viewpoint of the world. When you have people helping you have different talents and different capabilities, you can move along much more easily. And you're going to get to it, but when you're independent, you get to be a little angry because you basically have nobody to let out any of your feelings on. And therefore you take it, you put them within. And basically it becomes physical. In fact, I was going to say, Mrs. Rob in her letter said, Ed used to have nightmares and he used to be sick to his stomach regularly. And at Mrs. Rob's, things changed because I had someone who was definitely interested. And I think that's really one of the most important characteristics of the foster care system, is the fact that if the people are interested, they can replace that father-mother requirement that all children have. And I must say all people have.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as you are sharing this, it really brings up resilience, right? And, so you were able to find some folks, that you were able to belong to in different ways and build your resilience. Though, and like you said, we'll talk about this in a minute, there was some of that protective, that wall that was still up. And yet, I found it so interesting that you went to college and you were doing this engineering program. And, even though, you felt like an outsider, you always seemed to find your niche in many ways. And you said, when you operate on passion, it isn't work, it's pleasure. And one of those, anecdotes that you shared that I just thought was so enlightening and sort of insightful, both to who you are, but how you kind of found your niche despite challenges, was starting the humor magazine and really, finding a way to bring some levity into your life, even when you were challenged and you were struggling. And that seems to be sort of this innate kind of skill that you have to bring your passion into the challenging situations. And I would love to hear how that has really opened doors and opportunities for you, kind of this intuition of this is what I want to do, this is what I, find joy in, and kind of your natural perseverance.
That's really probably the most important question. And it goes back to, and that's where I want to communicate with the Wiley Scholars and every young person, basically, your childhood. And I think this is one of the things that you can learn from the book. Your childhood gives you a certain experience. And no matter what that experience is, it has advantages and disadvantages. And I believe very strongly in my life that disadvantages ended up being advantages for me. Things like adaptability. If you are in 5 foster homes and the YMCA, and you end up in a couple of orphanages, you go from place to place. And each one of those places, you've got to find your place. And this gives you also resilience in addition to adaptability. And resilience is kind of like a muscle. If you use it once, it's pretty strong. You keep using it, then you become the fact that I can fall down, get back up again. And as soon as you do that a few times, then you're not afraid. You eliminate the most important problem you have as a person like myself, is fear. Fear of doing things basically can destroy your ability to move forward. But if you fall down a couple of times, then you'll fear nothing. I mean, I didn't fear taking physics. I could have flunked, and I nearly did flunk, but I went on. I bounced up, went back to engineering physics, and graduated as an engineer. I wasn't a physicist. But I found too, in trying things out, you learn about yourself. So if you can eliminate fear and eliminate anger to some extent, and get this feeling that you're going to be able to bounce back. And by the way, we all bounce back. I mean, I tell people very clearly, there's only 2 experiences in life. One is success, and the other is a learning experience. And it's an old cliche, but you learn much more from your failures than you do from your success. Humor Magazine was a very important experience for me, because I really felt that, Rochester was a very difficult place. We flunked half the engineers every year, and we were spent I had 6 8 o'clocks every week, and I was in a laboratory every afternoon. So it wasn't much fun. On the weekends, we had a few hours between Saturday at 4 o'clock and midnight, and then Sunday we were back to work. So I thought that basically Rochester, like some other universities, was a place where fun went to die. So I decided I would create a humor magazine, which everybody was against. All of the president on down, and including the librarian. But what it did, it gave me a chance to put people together. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really found my passion. I found a passion for putting people together to accomplish a mission or a project.
Yeah.
And what I got a great kick out of was watching people do better than they thought they could. Mm-hmm. And that was really the essence of my management style. And later on, I added another little element to it as I got older, is the ability you can accomplish almost anything. And again, a cliche, if you don't worry about who gets the credit. Mm-hmm. So you give people credit for things they can do. For example, the cartoonist. I mean, I brought this guy aboard. I couldn't draw with a straight rule. In fact, my mentor at the university was Oscar Miner, who was the mechanical engineering professor. He felt so sorry for me. We became very close friends, because I barely made it through mechanical drawing my first year. But the cartoonist, I gave him credit because he could do something I couldn't do, but it was very important to the whole project.
Mhm.
And so that this was a whole experience for me. And I didn't realize at that point in time that this was one of my true passions,
Mhm.
was the idea of putting people together. Later on, as I went to business school and my first jobs and so forth, I started to realize that this management idea was something that really turned me on.
Yeah,
But it was the
so
ability to get over that fear of taking on something new, calling up 30 people and say, we're going to do this.
yeah, I wanted to ask you kind of, when did that light bulb of, oh, this isn't just how I do business, or this isn't just something that happens, it's actually an intentional skill, bringing people together, finding people with different skill sets, aligning those skill sets. When did that light bulb kind of, click for you? When did you realize that that was something that was very unique about who you were?
It was not at college, and it wasn't in the Navy. And at E.F. Hutton, it started. And I take this, we have this experience. I spend usually the last week of the year reviewing the year, going through the process, trying to understand myself. As I think in the book, I talk about this. You have to solve self first.
Mm-hmm.
Then you solve family, then work, and then community if you're lucky. But I had to solve self first. And I always reviewed the kinds of things I did and whether I enjoyed them, whether they were beneficial. For example, I spent my entire life trying to solve anger because my anger was basically focused on myself, which was good. Focused on other people is really bad, but I still had outward anger, but I had to focus on that. So I started to learn about, at E.F. Hutton, I had to put a team together. We did an unbelievably good job. At Lehman, I had a couple of teams. When I finally took over my own company, Firm & Cells, where we had 80 employees, and I started to write a Magna Carta, what I was going to do. I started to realize that these past opportunities, my success was because of this attitude that I had. It was an attitude, and people recognized it. They felt that I was in their camp, that I wanted them to do better. I also started to really come to grips with it. It wasn't manipulative. I came to grips with the fact that if you're really interested in someone doing better than they think they can, having them exceed their own expectations, boy, you've got a really wonderful partner in whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that is important. And what happens is you then do better than you think you can.
That's right.
If you try to project this. But I
Yeah.
started to realize that it was a collection of looking back and saying, why did it work at E.F. Hutton? Why did it work at Lehman Brothers? And now that I've taken over my own job, now I really said, I'm going to really make this an overt act. And I did it by actually putting people in place. I had a woman at Firm & Cells who in the morning would come and tell me anything was going on with people's personal lives. Who was having a baby, who was sick. I remember the classic example was one of the guys, this is a kid on the New York Stock Exchange floor. At the time, we had about 200 employees. So I met him maybe, but I didn't know who he was. He was giving his kidney to his brother, one of his kidneys. So I called him up. It wasn't something that I just called him up and said, hey, I'm just taken by what you're doing. And I didn't realize that resonated through the whole firm. Everybody talked about it. Mm-hmm. And so then, I started to collect this. And then to me, the same thing happened when I started getting involved in Indian mercenaries, different kinds of people, but same kind of experience. Mm-hmm. And one thing you do recognize is you recognize that you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. Yeah. So you have some people that can do things you can't do. And if you let them know that is real. Look, you're doing something I can't do, but it's necessary for the project. They feel really good, and they should. Then there's other people, who you could do this pretty well, but you don't like doing it. And they said, you're doing something I can do, but boy, you're doing a little better than I can do, and I don't really like doing that. So what you end up in a system, and what I ended up with at Firm & Cells after a couple of years, was I ended up doing only those things which I was good at, that I like doing. Mm-hmm. I go back to the Humor magazine. I flash back to that when I started to study the me, the self. We had to sell advertising in order to stay alive because the university wasn't going to fund us. That's a whole other story. So we went out and we sold advertising to local businesses. And let me tell you, if you sell something to people you never met before, something that doesn't exist, you're in pretty good shape for the rest of your life. And that's what we did. But I didn't like doing it. So I hired a young gal, and she took it over, and she did a much better job than I did. And I told her the fact that I would go with her anytime, but I really didn't like, approaching people I didn't know, selling something that didn't exist. So it was a collection. And I give that to people over time. Stop and reflect at least once a year, at least once every couple of years, who you are and how you change and what is working for you and what isn't working for you. And, as we get older, there's certain things you can't do any longer. Also, you pick up stuff, I don't think I was grateful until I was 50. Think about that.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm curious. What does that mean?
It's a very curious thing because, early on, I was very successful early on. So in the book, you'll find out I caught the disease, the self-caught disease called hubris. And so I could do anything. I was 35 years old. I could market, I could sell, I could manage the firm, I could manage people, I could manage money. And I found that was a mistake and I lost that firm. And so I got healed again when the next operation. I said, no, you can't do that again. So I started surrounding myself with more people that can do things I could do. But I didn't thank people. I tried to get them to do better than they could, but I didn't really thank them a lot. I started someplace in firm and sales just after I took over. I started really saying, thank you, I'm grateful. And even now people say, how are you? I don't say I'm well. I say I'm grateful because I am grateful. Now, at 84, you got to be grateful.
Yeah.
But I think that's very important. And I hooked up with a fellow named Walter Green, who wrote a book called This Is the Moment. And he did something which changed his life and changed my life. When he was 70 years old, he made a list of 44 people who had given him time and energy. And he took a year off from everything he was doing and went to see each one of them physically and said, thank you. And so I have found that to be the fact is, every time I do a trade in the stock market, I always end with buy so-and-so, thanks. And what happened now is my broker comes back and says, thank you, Ed. He always says, thank you. So, it's like smiling at people and getting smiled back again. But for a while I was, an angry young man doing a good job and making people work hard, appreciating them, but not saying thank you. Yeah. But gratitude came into my life, I say probably in the late 40s when I took over my own company. And I realized it was my company and these people were my people and they really deserved my gratitude.
Yeah. I think as hearing your reflection, it also makes me think about your relationship with your father, and that one of the things that you speak about is how much was left unsaid, right? After his passing. And you say, it dawned on me after his death that we would never reconcile because any opportunity for doing so had passed and would never come again. And I would never have closure. And we spoke about this when we met earlier. I've had that experience of not finding closure with my birth father. And I know many, many folks who are on this call, many of our students also have that experience of not finding closure with family members. And yet I thought it was so interesting that when you went to settle his estate, you went to his home and he had this pendant from Harvard on his wall. And you saw these things that really showed that even though he may not have said it, he was so proud. And yet what wasn't said, right? And how that really was damaging, and why didn't he say that? There's stories of his own, stuff that I'm sure you've thought about, some of which you shared in the book. But I'm just curious in what ways you have made peace with the things that were unsaid between you and your father, and how that's, shaped your relationships. I mean, clearly, as you said, it's really shaped the way you think about business, right? Because it translated into, I'm not going to be that person. I'm really going to be somebody who's very intentional. And so I just would love to hear more about that.
The magic word, intentional, really is. Yeah. It goes way back. When my father died, he died suddenly. He pulled his car over and had a heart attack and died. So, and he was a vegetarian, and I had no idea that he was going to die. Now, I was married with 2.5 children. I was running my own little venture, which was very, very taxing. So, the list of things to do, one of the things was not to worry about my relationship with my father, which was a mistake. But, and he basically had disagreed with almost everything I did. Don't leave the Navy. Don't leave your engineering job. Don't go to Harvard. don't go into financial business and don't marry Barbara. So it was a pretty tough thing for me. So I let myself off the hook. But even when he died, even though I felt I'd done what I thought I could do, given all the difficulty we had, it still didn't work. So I went and got help. And by the way, that's why it goes back. In the old days, when I went to college or in my teens and so forth, people didn't get help. If you got help, you were in trouble, quote unquote. And I went and got help. I had a wonderful woman named Peggy Penn at the Ackerman Institute. And she prescribed something which I think is interesting. You can do it whether your parents die or not. But she made me write letters to my father and ask questions. And then I would write letters back to him and answer the questions, some of which I couldn't answer.
Yeah.
It took me 6 months of writing. And I would take the letters to her and she would criticize them. You haven't been honest with it. You haven't been straightforward. And that worked out pretty well. But what it did to me, and the word intentional is good, I try now not to hold back. I try to pay attention. If I have difficulty with a person, I'll bring that person forward and talk to them. I mean, my wife and I have this rule: never go to bed angry. So either you apologize or you come to the solution before you go to sleep at night. And I think that's very important. My people I've worked with in business, I mean, when you have a bunch of people and they're all doing different things, you get into difficulty on a regular basis.
Sure.
And calling them in and saying, let's sit down and talk about it person to person. Forget that I'm the boss. Let's just sit down and let's talk about it person to person. Making the intention. It sometimes doesn't work out, but at least they know you're interested. Sometimes I would say my average probably was 3 out of 4. In the book, you'll see I didn't get along with one of the founders of Furman Cells. It was Furman Cells, Meagher, Dietz, and Bernie. Bernie was a fantastic analyst and a very smart guy. We didn't get along. And I called him in many times to talk to him. And in the book, you'll see, I said, when he said, I'm leaving the firm and what you're doing, he said, is going to result in the firm drowning in red ink. And, 12 months later, I sold the firm for $125 million to Xerox, which was a classic experience. But Jim, I couldn't get through to. But so many other people. I mean, I clash constantly with my sales manager and my director of research. We talk constantly. And, in those situations, what you find when you do draw people out and you are intentional, you turn out you're not right all the time. And one of the great things about calling someone in is if it turns out that he or she is right and you're wrong, you win them forever.
Yeah.
And if you admit that. So the experience, and the first couple of times it was difficult for me because I was a very smart guy and had all this success behind me and so forth. And I knew what was right or wrong. I started to recognize I didn't know all the rights and wrongs. And you learn so much with that. People bring out their arguments, completely if they know you're listening. And I try to listen.
Yeah. And, I think that you being willing to do your own work around the loss of your father, right? And taking a moment to really understand the gravity, even though, like you said, I think it was right before you had your last baby girl, and the timing wasn't great, but you knew that you needed to do that work so that you could move forward in the best way possible.
It was at the same time that Corey was being born, but I had to do it because it was fresh.
Yeah.
I couldn't put it off. Because it was bothering me. It was a huge problem because he was all that I had.
Right.
And I many of the people who have worked with me, did you hate your father? No, I love my father. And I as I reflect back on, he did what he could do. And now that I've dealt with a lot of people who have had bad things happen to them in their life, people that are, up have done extremely well and come into difficulties, it's a very hard thing to step down. And he stepped down at age 29 from the top of the world to the bottom of the world. You don't get over that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so as I give him credit, he did what he could do. Yeah. And he only had one job, which he was successful at. Just turned out it was one being at sea at all times. And so that was a tough one.
Yeah. I'd so admire just the tremendous amount of grace that you have been able to find. And I think that grace also transfers to yourself. You've been able to extend yourself grace. And, several times throughout the book, you mention your struggle with anger and that there were times that you were aware of it and you purposefully sort of pushed it down. And at times, it served you in different ways. And I would love to hear how you sort of reconciled the anger that you had within you.
Well, anger when I was a young man was very helpful
Mhm.
because, being small, and I was small, I was tiny, diminutive almost. I didn't think I wasn't 5 foot until I was 15 years old, but, in the, 8, 9, 10, I was 4'6" and weighed 60 pounds. And, if you got into a difficulty, if you were angry, you went at somebody, and even though they may have won the fight, if you hurt them, then they left you alone. And the word got around that this guy wouldn't be pushed around. So, and also anger in non-physical form drove me.
Mm.
I was angry that I wasn't successful, or I was angry that I didn't get an A on a test and so forth. So it made me work harder.
Yeah.
On the other hand, and I must say, Barbara, my wife, has said this a couple times. What's nice, if there is a nice thing about anger, most of the anger was inner directed.
Sure.
I very rarely had anger with other people, once in a while, but very rarely. But an anger did show when I had made a mistake or I'd done something wrong or things didn't go my way. I would get angry externally. I would throw a phone, or when on a tennis court or on a golf course, and that was embarrassing and not attractive, and it didn't make me someone that people wanted to be with.
Mhm.
I guess my other capabilities allowed them to put up with me, but it wasn't pleasant to have you throw a golf club or a tennis racket. But it was a way for me to release the anger without taking it out on anybody else. I took it out on myself. But I rationalized it over, and I'm less angry now than I've ever been. Occasionally it still comes up
Mhm.
because it was a protective mechanism.
Right.
Recognize, when I got angry, it drove me. So I found out anger, then success. Anger, then you win the fight. Going back in my childhood, I remember a bully, much bigger kid, came after me, and I reached up and I grabbed his collarbone and I pulled on it. And I can still remember him,
Wow.
screeching, and the word got around that this guy was a little
Wow.
tiny guy, but I, don't mess with him. But I had to go through that a number of different times, because whenever you change neighborhoods, you got to find out in those days where you fit. There was guys that were bigger than you and guys who were smaller than you were. And so we had the same thing at the orphanage. Both the places, you sort of had a rites of passage. Wasn't horrible. And kids got in much more physical fights now than in those days. And they weren't difficult. They weren't bruising or anything. Nobody used anything but their hands, and that was a positive experience. But the anger played an important part in my life, and I spent time thinking about it, and thinking about it has allowed me to sort of control it much better.
Mm-hmm. I think having that awareness that, it is something that comes from a very real place for you. And like you said, it's been a protective mechanism, and it really has led to success. There's no denying that it is catapulted you forward in moments that you needed it to. And so when we talked about legacy, and folks will read your book, that folks on here know you, folks maybe just getting to know you, hearing all of your, and you've done all these amazing things, and they'd look at you and they think, you've built these businesses and you've really fulfilled the narrative of being a self-made man, right? But what's clear to me, and, in our discussions, is that your idea of legacy really goes beyond the businesses that you have established and the successes that you've had on Wall Street. And I would love to hear your reflections on legacy and what you feel truly matters in, the history of your life.
The most, somebody asked me, what are your legacies? The most important legacy by far is my family, my wife and my children and my grandchildren. That was the legacy the only legacy I really wanted early on was the white picket fence and the family. And I got that legacy. And I passed that on to all the young Wiley scholars and almost anybody else who listen. That's really the only legacy that counts on a long-term basis. And, I had a very successful business career, but let's talk about that for a minute. I was at E.F. Hutton, and I built a business there, and E.F. Hutton has gone by the boards. It's gone. At Lehman Brothers, I built 2 businesses, and Lehman Brothers is gone. Furman Sellers was a crown. We built a business from 70 people to 800 people. We sold it to Xerox. We bought it back. We sold it again to ING at a very big price. $600 million. 200 partners. Brought my business career to a conclusion, and everything else. Where's Furman Sellers today? It's gone. It's no longer a legacy. it merged into ING merged it into the ABM AMRO, and slowly they dissolved it, and the name doesn't even exist anymore. So my business legacy is gone. But let's take another legacy, University of Rochester. This is what I call the fourth segment of life: self, family, business, and community or society. So I had a chance, and it was a privilege, to become the chairman of the board of trustees at the University of Rochester. And I sat around with the family and said, in order to do this, I've got to give a transformational gift. And so I said, this is not my money. It's your money, Barbara. It's your money, GB. Your money, Corey. Your money, Brad. And I think to do that, I've got to give more money than George Eastman. And I got the number, and it was a big chunk of my net worth. But in doing that, they were, I guess, kind enough to do not only name the school after me, which was kind of part of the deal, I guess, being Hajim School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, which also gave me another whole legacy, because I really believe America needs more engineers. Here's a way of doing it. Then they turned around and named a quadrangle after me. And then they put a statue up of me. I'm the first one in my neighborhood with a statue, by the way. And 8-9 feet of bronze with my arms held out. So that's a real legacy. As the fellow up at the Democratic Chronicle said, I walk past your statue every day. Now, they haven't done anything terrible to it yet, but I suspect they will. But that's a real legacy. That's a legacy that will last forever. In fact, they asked me, what do you feel best about as far as the school? What's wonderful today is that there are 400 kids that graduate every year that have to pronounce my name correctly. No, it's terrible. I mean, Mr. Hajim, how are you? Hajim, and I saw you in your notes, you put down phonetically, you put Hayjim, Hajim. So that's a real legacy, and it's a great experience. Plus I have all these people, all these scholars running around. When we die, scholars will go back up to 25 or 30 a year, and that'll be nice for the rest of my, forever. There'll be people carried my name. Then an unusual legacy that came to me just by chance was the Nantucket Golf Club. As chance would have it, I couldn't get into the normal golf club up there. So I went home and said to Barbara, sell a house. And she said, oh, no, don't do that. Can't leave Nantucket. I said, I can't get into the golf club. I really want to play golf. And she said, why don't you build a golf course? You built one in Vail. Why don't you build one here? So went out, found the land, called the fellow Fred Green he's on the phone, and he did a fabulous job. He flew out. We wandered around in an SUV, stood on top of it because the places we were looking at were covered with scrub oak. And he says, it looks great. So we built a golf course. And 25, 24 years later, we've basically made 500 families very happy. Their husbands and wives can play golf. And we created a charity called the Children's Charity, which is now the largest charity on the island. It puts 2 kids in college every year. And my next crusade, which you were going to get a kick out of, is vocational education. We give 3 vocational scholarships every year as well. So it's not only, and it is, if I get a chance, I'd love to take this. And Fred probably should do it. He's on the call. We should take it to other country clubs, because we're more than a country club. We're an institution. But here again, another legacy. Mm-hmm. And they give me much more credit than I deserve. There were 5 or 6 other key guys playing the role, getting new members in. We had to raise, $45 million. So it took an enormous effort. There were 6 directors, and they went out and scratched everybody they knew to get them involved and so forth. And many, many stories, like the fellow I called up, and he said, can I check with my wife? And I said, no. He said, okay, I'm in. But that's a real legacy. It's a real legacy because it'll be there forever. Furman Cells is gone. E.F. Hutton's gone. Lehman's gone. But that golf club will be there probably for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful experience. I didn't build the golf course, but I was there when they were building it. Golf course building is like making art with a bulldozer. You take 300 acres, which could have 120 homes on it, and have five single family, structures, a club and some places for people to stay. And then you take a bulldozer and you move as little dirt as possible, leave the natural undulation. And you've got something which is absolutely beautiful. The final legacy we're involved with right now. I'm not sure it's going to be a legacy. I'm not sure I'm going to sell many books, but the book to me is somewhat of a legacy.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping, and the only reason I did it, and Skyhorse convinced me to do it, I was going to just self-publish and give it to family and friends, is that my life says a lot of things. First thing it says is anything is possible. If you're 4'6", you weigh 66 pounds, and you're in a foster home, and you can end up giving the largest gift in the history of University of Rochester, anybody can do anything. But there's also lessons along the way. And if I can help a few people learn earlier about the problems you can have by doing some things which they shouldn't do, then maybe, the whole thing will be a legacy. And there are things in there. And at 35, having just young businessmen worry about hubris. Hubris is terminal. And it's just a simple disease. You get into a business and you're very successful, and everybody around you is telling you how great you are and how successful you are, and you start to believe your own stuff. And that can be a disaster. If I can have people just worry a little bit about hubris in their early careers, someone will not have to step back, as I had to step back. If I had stayed with my original company, it would have been a very successful career, and I wouldn't have made a few enemies that I made, and I wouldn't have destroyed a few people by, having a very poor performance in 1972. Big mistakes. And just little things like, if I can get people to take that week at the end of the year, or the week every 3 years, where you sit down and say, am I doing the right things? And then basically, as you know, at the end of the book, I have my 4 Ps, which I'm hoping to elaborate on later on. If I can have people develop a conversation with themselves, which is more productive than their present conversations, that could be a legacy. And so I'm kind of excited about that. I don't know how long I'm going to last, but if I last long, if I can come through, if people can actually make conversations with themselves in a better fashion, not necessarily my fashion, but if I just have them focus in on the only constant in life is your inner voice, and that conversation with your voice, just saying to yourself, you're angry, Ed, why are you angry? And then have that conversation. I think that could be a legacy in itself. So I'm going to have some fun with it. Talking again, what's interesting about this legacy, I'm meeting terrific people that I never would have met. Judy, the guy up in Rochester is an old timer. He's a journalist. He's a journalist and professor. He writes for the local newspaper. Walking past my statue, he said, this was a great thing for him. And he developed, in his article, he talks about the effect on my not telling about my background when I went to Rochester, how it went through my whole life. The fact is, I'm learning so much about myself by writing this book and talking to people, not only by writing it, but also people reading it and saying, look at this. Mm-hmm. So it's been a great experience. So it'll be an inner legacy as well as an external legacy. I've overdone the legacy thing. But by the way, I started out, Maddy, not knowing what a legacy was, not knowing I'd ever have a legacy. But the biggest legacy of all is by far the family. It's Barbara, it's GB, it's Corey, it's Brad, and it's the troops. The little guys are just fabulous. We have 7 grandsons and a granddaughter. And what's come out of their mouth over the last, oldest is 28. Over the last 28 years, it's been more than paid back any kind of cost. It's just been fantastic. They're just unbelievable. And I have to give you one example. My youngest grandchild, who was given a new room with a carpet and a bedspread, and his father gave him wallpaper which kind of matched. And his father asked him how he liked the bedspread, and he said, "I don't like it." "Why don't you like it?" He said, "It matches the floor, it matches the wallpaper." He says, "It doesn't match the person."
Very astute.
And they're like that. It goes on with all of them. They've just been great in the very beginning. And that really makes it. So family is everything. Mm-hmm. Friends come right behind it. Yeah. I've said this at my 50th, my 60th, my 70th, 80th birthday. It's all about family and friends. It really is. And those are the legacies.
Yeah. I do find your ability to really capitalize on relationships and having created so much social capital. That's your richness. That's the wealth that very much comes through. And, that you're very quick, as you said, to not care about the credit, to give the credit away, to share the credit. And I think that in many ways, when I read, your story, which I do think will be a very big part of your legacy, that is just so clear. And how, for all of us to sit back and reflect on how are we building social capital and relational wealth is really just so critical. So I have one last question. So folks, if you want to ask Ed questions, we, are ready to kind of move into those questions, but very, briefly, kind of, one thought, one answer. I always ask everybody this question, but what is your greatness, Ed?
Oh, I don't have greatness.
Oh, come on.
No. My greatness, my greatness is ahead of me, I hope. If I have greatness, it'll be because this book and things that I've done in my life affect other people in a positive fashion, if there is a greatness. I think humility is so much more important than greatness. I mean, we were so lucky. I've lived in the golden age of America, in the golden age of the world. It's contextual. We've had a great experience, and I've lived in the greatest country in history of the world, and I've lived in its greatest period. So, but my greatness will be, if there is a greatness, it's Sarah Walters, one of my scholarship students, standing up in front of 100 people and saying, "Mr. Hajim, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here." She got her PhD in optical engineering, got a master's in business in her spare time. And I think she's getting married, and she's taking postdoctoral work, and she's a concert pianist and a concert violinist. And I fact checked that. I think those are all the things. But that's my greatness. Yeah. And that's what really makes things work. But there is no, if you start thinking you have greatness, then you're not asking the most important question, which is what's next.
Yeah.
And what's next for me is meeting people like you. And by the way, this social capital you talked about, it's an evolution. I would think when I was a young man, I had very little social capital, and it's been an accumulation. Over time, you start to realize that everything morphs over life, and now I cherish the social capital that I have. And you look at the acknowledgements in the book. I mean, even though I named a great number of people, I still left out people that I really feel have contributed to my life. Mm-hmm. So many people have contributed to my life, and almost every day, someone really cashes in and says, "Hey, Ed, thank you, Ed. You've done this for me." And I say, "Thank you, because you've contributed to me."
Yeah, you've built quite a community, and it's really amazing. So I want to turn to our questions. We have some questions from the audience, and I will read them here. So Lynn asked, any clues for young people who survive by trusting only themselves to learn how to trust others?
That's where I think you have to sort of make an inventory of what this foster care has done for you, or what your background has done for you. Accept the fact that you have adaptability. Accept the fact that you have resilience. Accept the fact that you have perseverance. All right? Therefore, you can overcome fear. And fear is basically trusting. Mm-hmm. And then you have to be willing to fail in the trust experience. You have to pick your initial people you're going to trust carefully, and be willing to say, and start to build the characteristics of the kind of people you want to trust. But you have to risk it, because trust is everything. And having people you can trust. I mean, I trust my wife with everything. I mean, I basically say, find a partner. I mean, even the partner is not a wife or a spouse, but find a friend you can trust, and trust them. And also don't look at 100%. Don't let, this is again, pardon my cliches, but don't let the perfect ruin the good. Mm-hmm. And we're all packages. Yeah. And so one of your problems is you're seeking perfect, which I was seeking for a long time. It took me a long time to just say, everybody's a package, and I'm going to take the good, I'm going to accept the good. And in the trust area, you'll get certain kinds of trust out of various kinds of people. You'll need certain kinds of trust. But I think overcome fear, go out and don't trust everybody. There are people that are untrustworthy, no two ways about it. Life's not simple, but start trusting.
Yeah, I love it. I hear the engineer in you coming out, a little trust experiment. You have all of these ways of measuring it. And I love it.
Yes. Design the project, right?
Yes.
Right? Get the results, then
I love
start
it.
over again.
So we have a question from Steven Spiegel. He asks, how did your Wall Street career become your passion?
Well, that brings up my fourth P, is plans. It didn't really. I never took an investment course at Harvard Business School. And I was going to go back to Hercules. I was an engineer. I loved Hercules. I loved my job at Hercules. Servicing salesmen, selling a new product like polyethylene and polypropylene couldn't be more exciting. Guys would call up and say, got to make it lighter, got to make it stronger, got to make it lighter. And I had all fun doing that. And so when I called Hercules, I said to them, I'm ready to come back. They said, well, you were making 6,500. We're going to give you 7,500. And I said, why? And they said, well, you're still a bachelor. You don't need a lot of money. And then I was taken by what was that most of the young people, the bright people on the school were going to Wall Street. And I started to interview a few Wall Street firms, and I realized the difference in the job. Because one of the tenets, one of my principles that started to evolve in my life was freedom. And as an engineer, you don't have a lot of freedom. And I started to see on Wall Street, if you were really good, you developed a lot of freedom. And then this crazy job in California came along because I had to go to a wedding. That's in the book. You'll see it was totally serendipity. I had no interest in the mutual fund business. I mean, I didn't like mutual funds, but they told me what the job was. Physically, the job was to go and visit CEOs of companies on an airplane, usually riding first class, and come back and write a report. And in addition, you had to basically, read the newspaper. And I couldn't figure out why anybody pay you to do that, rather than wearing a long white coat with plastic glasses and have steaming cauldrons all over you and columns and people yelling over the phone to get things done. This seemed like a very interesting job. And I never took an investment course, but I did cheat a little bit because 5 of us wanted to start a company, and I would go to this company, Capital Research, be a mutual fund guy, because I could run around and find a company to buy. But then I fell in love. I fell in love with basically the stock market, with finding companies that are interesting. It was an intellectual puzzle constantly, and it also had people more involved. Engineering, you're looking at a lot of physical stuff, but in the financial business, it's a great deal of it is people, their thoughts, how they're facing their businesses, what they're doing. And so I started to fall in love, and then the people in the business turned out to be really interesting. And the older people in the business were interesting. One of the problems with old engineers, a lot of them I found very tired. They had lost basically the ability to handle the new technology. And in Hercules, many of the old engineers got booted out. The technology was old. But I found the older people in the financial business were the most interesting. They had great jobs that last forever. And in fact, Phil Neuberger Berman was managing money he was over 100. So basically, the financial business sounded to me the place to be, and it was really luck. I also caught a wave. I was convinced once I got into it, the financial business was going to be one of the growth areas in America. Sounds corny, but it really was. I could see it. As a mutual fund business, I got there. They had 300 million under management. By the time I left, they had 4 billion. You could see the baby boomer generation coming up. They're going to have to invest and so forth. So I had these things working, and I felt one of the things I started to work with in the finance business, I found that the companies that caught waves did the best. They had the wind behind them. So here I had to find my wave. And the wave I found was basically the stock market and the growth of the financial business. So Steve, the reason I stayed in the business is because I hired you in Chicago, and you were just a good friend for a lifetime.
Well, shout out to Steve. I love it. So our last question for the night is from Laurelette. And they ask, if you could go back and give yourself advice, what would you say to your younger self? Which I think is a great question for us.
A great question. Well, one of the questions I got from others to say, what do you have a do-over? And I would never, there's no do-overs, because if I changed it, who knows what would happen? Since it came out pretty good the way it was, I don't really want for anything, except time. And so why would I do any do-overs? I would, if I had get my young person something, I would basically start to deal with my inner self earlier if I could. That's what I want to communicate to young people. I want somewhere between 16 and 25 that you spend a lot more time trying to understand who you are. What are your passions? What are your principles? What kind of people, what kind of partners do you want? I would spend much more time. I lost that somewhere, I guess, college, Navy, engineer. I lost that. And I just started to get mixed up in my daily activity. I didn't spend enough time working on myself. So that's the advice I'd give you. And I think the advice I'd also give you is find a partner seek a part. I didn't seek partners at all early on. I was going to do it myself. I was self-reliant. I almost didn't, even as late as Lehman Brothers, I had a partner then in the first iteration of Lehman Brothers wasn't as successful because I was going to do it myself. It was the brokerage business. And I basically tried to do it myself. I didn't seek partners. I got a partner in the second iteration of Lehman Brothers, which was the money management business. This fellow, Steve Bletcher, came and he started to show me he could do things I couldn't do. He could do almost everything I didn't want to do. So I started to recognize. So young people, spend a little more time on yourself. Spend time on finding the right partners. In today's world, it's even more important than in my world. My world, there still were, I give myself an excuse. In my world, there were still people who did it by themselves. You know, General Patton. There were certain kinds of people who you really could look up to that seemed to do it by themselves. But in today's world, it's absolute collaboration. So spend time thinking about the kinds of people you want to surround yourself. In business, friends, and in philanthropy, in society and community. And by the way, there are different kinds of people as well. You know, you're going to surround yourself with different people if you're working on a university problem than you are in a business problem. So two things: spend more time on yourself and spend more time thinking about the kind of partners. You know, if you're in college, really find a friend. I found 2 friends that really changed my life in college. And I didn't know it. I didn't seek them as much. They kind of sought me, which was interesting. I've been a very lucky guy. People sort of sought me. I guess maybe because I was needy, so they sought me. But Dick Wiedemeyer, you know, started taking me home on holidays. You know, we were in the Navy together. He went right to Harvard Business School. I went to work. He wouldn't stop. He basically said, "You're coming to Harvard Business School. This is the thing for you." And I did go, and it changed my life. Zane Burdett was a sophomore. I was a freshman. He got me through organic chemistry and he became my doctor for 40 years, more than my doctor. I mean, any problem I had, I basically ran past Zane. He was a Phi Beta Kappa. He was an endocrinologist. He was a great human being. You know, he was also the smartest guy I've ever known. And he became a friend. So don't leave college without a couple of these kind of young people, either girls or guys, whatever it is.
Excellent words of advice. And I think too, our friend Paul Blavin, who also asked in the chat, is there truly a self-made man? I think that answer is no. There's people who are made through their relationships with others. And I just want to say, Ed, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been wonderful. Your book is absolutely fabulous. I encourage everybody to read it, pick it up, share it with other people. If you're connected with students, I highly recommend you get this book and share it with other students and encourage them to read it and learn from Ed, like I have, and like I think all of us will. Judy, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Yeah.
Thank you to both Ed and Maddie. That was fabulous. I want to also, in addition to going out and buying Ed's book, I would strongly encourage all of you to learn more about college students on campuses who are invisible in plain sight, just like Ed was when he arrived at college. We learned so much tonight. I think one of the things that I will continue to take away is the importance of building community. And that is something you clearly do, Ed, and we could all use a little more of that. That's what we try to do with the Wiley Network. We all need people to lean on. So let's lean on each other. Again, before we say goodnight, everybody go out, take one more look at the book. And let's go out there and buy some.
By the way, she's not on commission.
I am not on commission. So thank you all very much for coming. It was a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
One
Judy.
last
Thank you,
thing,
Maddie.
we will pass questions on to Ed that we did not get to answer. Good night, everybody.
Good night.